New Hampshire, September 19th, 1961. Betty and Barney Hill were driving home to Portsmouth from a short vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. Late at night, on empty roads, through the White Mountains. By every account, they were an unremarkable couple, which is part of what made their story so hard to dismiss. Barney worked for the U.S. Postal Service and had scored remarkably high on an intelligence assessment, according to author John Fuller. Betty worked in state social services. They were active in their community and members of the local NAACP chapter. Theirs was also an interracial marriage. Barney was black, Betty was white, in a country still years from national civil rights legislation, which meant the Hills were already accustomed to being looked at and doubted before they ever mentioned a UFO. Just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, as the road crested the shoulder of Mount Prospect, Betty noticed a light in the sky that didn't behave like a star, a plane, or a satellite. It moved. It grew brighter. It seemed to follow the car as they wound south through Franconia Notch. Barney pulled over more than once with binoculars. Each time, the light held its position before resuming its pursuit. By the time it was close enough to fill the windshield, Barney said he could make out a structure, windows, and shapes moving behind the windows, figures that appeared to be watching him back. That was the last thing either one of them could clearly remember for the next 2 hours. Their next clear memory was a strange beeping and the sensation of the car vibrating. They were now more than 35 miles farther down the road than they should have been, and it was nearly 5 a.m. when they reached their driveway. Hours later than the drive should have taken. Betty called Pease Air Force Base the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something had happened she couldn't explain. In that first report, she left out the humanoid figures Barney had described, worried it would sound like the account of a crackpot. That detail entered the record only afterward, years before hypnosis was ever used. Physical details compounded the unease in the days that followed. Barney's shoes were scuffed in a pattern that he couldn't account for. His binocular case turned up in the trunk with no memory of putting it there. Betty found a fine pattern of shiny circles on the trunk, later cited as possibly affecting a compass needle tested nearby. Her dress, freshly cleaned before the trip, had an unexplained pink powder on it and a tear she wouldn't look at again for 3 years. A fabric sample that 5 separate laboratories logged as containing a biological substance matching neither Betty nor Barney never identified. About 4 months after the encounter, a ring of warts appeared around Barney's groin in the exact spot he had felt a persistent, unexplained urge to examine since the first morning home. Both Hills developed nightmares, and Barney's anxiety grew severe enough to affect his health. Investigators took the case seriously from early on. Walter Webb of the Hayden Planetarium, working with the civilian research group NICAP, interviewed the Hills for 6 hours in October 1961 and came away calling her account ironclad. A month later, researchers Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson, along with Air Force Major James McDonald, sat with the Hills for 11 hours and zeroed in on the real problem. The drive, factoring in every stop, should have taken under 4 hours, not the roughly 7 it apparently did. It was McDonald who first suggested hypnosis to recover the missing time, over the initial objection of a psychiatrist who warned it could do more harm than good. Beginning in February 1964, Dr. Benjamin Simon, a Boston psychiatrist, hypnotized Betty and Barney separately, without either present for the other sessions. Under hypnosis, both described being taken from the car by humanoid figures and examined aboard a disc-shaped craft. Skin scrapings, hair and nail samples, and, in Betty's account, a long needle inserted into her abdomen that she was told was a pregnancy test. Betty also recalled being shown a star map and asking where the beings were from. Years later, school teacher Marjorie Fish cross-referenced Betty's sketch of that map against real stellar catalogs and proposed a match to the Zeti Reticuli system, a claim that would go on to define the gray alien archetype in later abduction lore, from Whitley Strieber to Bob Lazar. The Hills tried to keep the story private, sharing it only with their Unitarian Universalist congregation in 1963. A reporter obtained a recording of that talk without their cooperation, leading to a 1965 Boston Traveler newspaper series, and in 1966, John G. Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, the account that made the Hill case the first widely publicized alien abduction story in American history, and the template for missing time, physical exams, and star maps that shaped nearly every abduction account that followed. Nearly every specific detail of the Hills account, the beings, the examination, the star map itself, came out of hypnosis, and hypnosis is the weakest link in the whole case. In the 1960s, it was widely treated as a reliable way to recover buried memory. Decades of later research, including a formal finding from the American Medical Association's Council on Scientific Affairs, concluded the opposite. Hypnotically recovered memories can be less accurate than ordinary recall because hypnosis doesn't unlock accurate memory so much as it lowers a person's resistance to suggestion. A hypnotist doesn't even need to ask a leading question on purpose for one to slip in. None of that requires Dr. Simon to have done anything malicious. It just means a single tool that produced almost every detail of the Hills account is the same one modern researchers consider one of the least trustworthy ways to recover an accurate memory. That weakness in the method lines up with a specific documented coincidence. 2 weeks before Barney's pivotal session, there was an episode of The Outer Limits called The Bolero Shield, featuring an alien with large wraparound eyes, strikingly similar to the beings he'd go on to describe. Skeptic Martin Kottmeyer first identified the pattern. The episode aired February 10, 1964. Barney had mentioned no such eyes in 3 years of retelling the story, and in a hypnosis session dated February 22nd, 12 days later, he described and sketched them for the first time. Researcher Jason Colavito extended the pattern further. 5 days before the same February 22nd session, another Outer Limits episode, The Children of Spider County, aired. The story of a half-alien outcast whose car is stopped in the road by an alien, paralleling details of Barney's own biography closely enough, in Colavito's words, to go well beyond coincidence. And on January 31st, 1964, a Twilight Zone episode called Black Leather Jackets featured aliens disguised as humans in matching black leather jackets, echoing the Hills' own recollection of beings dressed in shiny black jackets. Betty herself referenced the Twilight Zone by name during one of her own sessions. Psychologists have a name for forgotten memory resurfacing later as something that feels entirely new: cryptomnesia. One broadcast lining up with one detail could be coincidence. 3 separate programs, each echoing a specific detail that emerged only under hypnosis, each airing in the narrow window of days before the sessions that produced them, is a much harder pattern to wave away. And Dr. Simon himself went on record saying he believed the Hills experience may have been a shared psychological event. Betty's dreams potentially bleeding into Barney's hypnotic recall. The star map fares no better under scrutiny. Marjorie Fish spent years building a 3-dimensional model of nearby sun-like stars, to match Betty's sketch, eventually producing Zeta Reticuli as a source. But of the 26 stars on Betty's map, Fish's solution only accounted for 15, setting the other 11 aside. Carl Sagan demonstrated on Cosmos that stripping the connecting lines from both sketches makes the resemblance mostly disappear. And researcher Charles Adberg later found a completely different set of 25 stars that matched Betty's sketch just as well. In the 1990s, updated astronomical data showed some of the stars that Fish relied on were much farther away than she'd realized, findings damaging enough that Fish herself ultimately retracted her own hypothesis. That didn't stop the Zeta Reticulum idea from taking hold in UFO culture anyway. A discarded sketch, drawn years after the fact under hypnosis by someone who already believed she had seen a star map, went on to help define an entire alien archetype. Betty's reliability as a witness to the sky takes another hit from a second sketch entirely. She was also asked to draw the ordinary night sky exactly as she remembered it the moment the object first appeared. Investigator Robert Schaefer compared it to the actual recorded sky over New Hampshire that night. The moon was missing. 2 planets that should have been clearly visible were gone, and in their place was a single point of light sitting almost exactly where Jupiter would have been. Schaefer's conclusion was that the object that started the entire chase may simply have been Jupiter, appearing and disappearing behind clouds on a dark mountain road, a known cause of so-called car-chasing UFO reports, where a bright stationary object seems to trail a moving vehicle as a trick of perspective. If Betty's memory of the ordinary sky was already this unreliable within hours of the event, it raises real questions about how much weight to put on a far stranger memory recovered years later under hypnosis of a star map from another galaxy. Jupiter isn't the only mundane candidate along that route. Cannon Mountain, which the Hills drove directly past, has an aircraft warning beacon at the top of its tramway station. Schaefer and researcher James D. McDonald, retracing the drive mile by mile, both pointed to it as a plausible source for at least part of the sighting. Close enough in appearance, through binoculars at night, that a lit tower roof could read as a hovering craft. The Hill's own book mentions a beacon near a restaurant closed for the night with its soda machines glowing in the window, and a lit billboard for the Jack-o'-lantern resort topped with an oversized illuminated jack-o'-lantern, a strong candidate for the large luminous moon shape both Hills recalled hanging in the trees. That's at least 3 distinct ordinary sources of exactly the kind of light the Hills struggled to explain. McDonald's retracing also exposed a shakier timeline than the case is usually credited with. In the Hills' earliest accounts, the sighting began a little after 10 p.m. In a later radio interview, they said it began after midnight. Another retelling put the object's approach at 3 in the morning, a drift of up to 5 hours across different retellings. McDonald's conclusion was blunt. There were no reliable time markers to anchor the story, and the Hills only seemed to have grasped how significant the missing time was after investigators pressed them on it directly, months into the interviews. The years after Barney's death in 1969 did not do the case any favors either. Betty kept investigating, but according to her niece, Kathleen Marden's own account, she drifted from the cautious approach that had made the original case compelling. She came to believe East Kingston was a personal UFO hotspot, returned there repeatedly, and eventually claimed hundreds of sightings sorted into her own private categories, including a UFO she said chased her car and blistered its paint with a beam, and beings she said she watched perform calisthenics beside a landed craft. At a 1980 UFO conference in New York, Schaefer documented Betty presenting hundreds of photographs, most too blurry to make out anything, and described her being jeered off the stage, not by skeptics, but by other believers in the room. Researchers who joined her later skywatching trips described her labeling ordinary streetlights as alien craft. Martin remains a dedicated defender of the original 1961 case, co-authoring research with physicist Stanton Friedman and arguing that Betty's later decline says nothing about the credibility of that first night. But the decline is well documented all the same, and it's part of the record any fair account of the case has to include. Whatever happened on that New Hampshire road in 1961, it changed two people permanently, one of whom carried it to an early grave, the other who spent 40 years trying to make sense of 2 hours she could never fully explain. Between a star map, its own author retracted, and a television broadcast that aired 2 weeks too early to be a coincidence, the ordinary explanations line up more neatly than the case's reputation suggests. What they don't fully erase is the fact that two people, independently hypnotized, produced matching, detailed accounts of something neither one could otherwise explain. And 60 years on, researchers are still arguing about whether memory ended and something else began. Betty died in 2004, having spent more than 4 decades as the most famous alien abductee in American history, and having reported more UFO encounters than almost anyone else on record. Kathleen Martin has spent much of the time since defending her aunt's legacy, continuing to publish rebuttals of the skeptical case well into the 2020s, still litigating exactly what happened during those 2 lost hours and how much of what came after should be allowed to color the judgment of that first night.